Hey, my friends, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we have got one and only one objective today, and that is to figure out what the deal is with this Herod who comes up in Matthew chapter 14. There are 11 billion Herods in the Bible. It just seems like every time you turn around, there's a Herod, and they have some different title that's a confusing title. It's hard to know which one is which. We've talked about this before, but specifically this time around, I want to focus on the Herod described in Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. It goes like this. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead. That's why miraculous powers are at work in him." And then Herod goes on to do some stuff with John, and we're going to get into that whole tragic story a little bit later on. To make sense of which Herod this is, we're going to have to rewind a few centuries before what's going on here around probably 28, 29, 30-ish AD. We're going to have to go back all the way back to 1,000 years before the time of Christ. You got King David, the most important, famousest king of all the kings of Israel ever, sitting on the throne, and then he dies, and his kid Solomon takes over, and then Solomon's kids, they don't get along so well. They don't get along with their dad so well. There's something of a civil war, and this ancient Hebrew kingdom splits into two parts. You got the southern kingdom of Judah, and you got the northern kingdom of Israel. It's up and down for both of these kingdoms through the centuries. And then in 722 BC, the northern kingdom falls to the Assyrians. And then in 586 BC, the southern kingdom falls to the Babylonians. In the process of that, pretty much everybody from both kingdoms gets dragged away into captivity. The northern 10 tribes associated with Israel are largely lost to history in Assyria. The southern tribes, they hang on a little bit better, and they exist as this unique subculture within Babylonian culture. But then the Persians come along, they defeat the Babylonians, and now the Persians under Cyrus the Great are the inheritors of what's left of the Jewish people. And Cyrus the Great is like, we don't need to have you all here. If you want to go home and rebuild and kind of govern yourselves, you can. And so some Jewish people living under Persian captivity in the East are like, no, we're going to stay here. We like Persia. It's cool. And some others are like, no, we're definitely going home. We're going to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and the temple and get everything cooking again there. This is the initiation of what is called Second Temple Judaism. This is a few hundred years before the time of Jesus. But as you know, the Greeks and the Persians get into fights, and eventually a Greek-ish leader named Alexander the Great does a big march of conquest, defeats everybody in the 4th century, the 300s BC. He topples Persia, and in the process of that, he bloodlessly conquers Jerusalem. It's not too long after that bloodless conquest, and Alexander the Great dies at a young age. I think he was 33. He appoints no heir, so his generals divide up this massive global empire that he left behind, and one general, Seleucus, the founder of the Seleucid Empire, is the one who ends up with Judea, Galilee, big picture Israel. And that goes okay maybe at first, but eventually the friction between that Alexandrian impulse to go and make the whole world more Greekified comes into conflict with the Jewish impulse to stay not Greekified and to be very Jewish. The relationship between the Greek overlords and the Jewish underlings deteriorates to the point where under the leadership of the Maccabees family, there's a great big revolt. The Jewish people win. They throw off their Greek oppressors, and they form a new dynasty that is sometimes called the Maccabean dynasty or the Hasmonean dynasty. This occurs a little over 100 years before the time that the Romans show up in the mid-ish 1st century AD, about 60 years and change before Jesus is born. Under the leadership of Pompey, the famous Roman general and statesman, the Jewish people are subjugated. Pompey enters the Holy of Holies, and Judea, as well as Galilee, Judea in the south, Galilee in the north, these become subject states of Rome or client king states of Rome, where the Romans allow a local ethnic ruler, an ethnarch, to govern and be more familiar with social affairs and whatnot, while the Romans appoint a more powerful but cooperating government from the home office to govern on the part of Rome. This is the political situation when Jesus shows up. Now, that ethnarch, or that client king that gets chosen by the Romans under the leadership of the Senate and then under the leadership of the first emperor, Caesar Augustus, is drawn from the Herod family. There's a guy named Antipater of Idumea, which is a region that is sort of Jewish-ish. If the Jews had got to pick who their ethnarch was going to be, they wouldn't have picked somebody from there. There's bad blood and ugly history, but this family curried favor with powerful political people in Rome, and Rome returned the favor, thinking they would have a cooperative family of rulers, a cooperative dynasty that would uphold their interests and represent their interests well in Judea and Galilee moving forward. Now, the big name from this family is not Antipater, but it is Herod the Great, the son of Antipater. And Herod the Great was great. He did a lot of amazing things. He was a dynamic builder. He was the type of despot dictator that thrived during this era of history in that part of the world. He played the political games. He was maniacal and crazy and violent to his own family. The Bible holds him out as being violent even toward babies in his old age, as he wanted to preserve his own authority. So Herod the Great is the guy who's in charge when Jesus is born. He's the guy the Magi come and talk to. He's the guy who tries to have the babies killed to get rid of Jesus, and he's the guy who dies, which prompts Joseph to feel ready to return home. Well, Herod the Great has a mess of a family tree coming out of him, and he had a couple of kids who he wanted to appoint to succeed him, but he came to believe that they were trying to conspire against him, so he had his own sons executed. And then, as a result, Herod's empire ends up being divided really 4 ways. So a quarter of Herod the Great's kingdom ends up being governed pretty much directly by the Romans. Another quarter of Herod the Great's empire gets governed by Herod Philip. Another quarter by a guy named Archelaus, for whom it did not go well, and he doesn't factor into the Bible story really much at all. And then the prominent quarter that comes up so much throughout all of the Gospels ends up being governed by our guy, right here in Matthew 14, Herod Antipas, who is also sometimes called Herod the Tetrarch. Now, Tetrarch, Tetris, 4, you see what they're doing there. This is a term that at its origin was meant to describe someone who governs a quarter of an area, but eventually Tetrarch came to just mean shared governorship. So then in the Gospels, every account that names Herod, other than the birth narrative stuff, which is referring to Herod the Great, every account that names Herod in the Gospels is referring to Herod Antipas, or by another name, the same guy, Herod the Tetrarch. He was probably born somewhere around 20 BC, maybe a little bit earlier, and he died after 39 AD. The sources we have are just a little bit vague on the front end of his life, but on the back end of his life, there's a reason we don't know exactly when he died, and we'll get to that in a minute. Antipas is often characterized as being an effeminate ruler, which just set aside all the stuff that people could get offended about right now, and let me just speak candidly about what we're talking about here without any commentary on now, one way or the other, regardless of what people think. There was a court style that was very acceptable in high society in this era of time in the early Roman Empire. And that court style, which was the opposite of the gruff, manly man of the frontier, was the more effeminate style leader who had more of a taste for the arts and fashion and court life, and usually was not associated with battle and getting out into the fray. I'm offering no judgment one way or the other, just trying to describe a historical reality. Through the centuries, historians, theologians, artists have tended to portray Herod Antipas as being of that more effeminate, refined, high court style. And as a result, you'll see that taken into account in his portrayal in old school paintings and in new school TV shows and movies and presentations like that. Some of that association is drawn on what looks like Jesus using what could be construed as a feminine form of the word fox when he refers to Herod Antipas as a fox at one point in Luke. We could break down the linguistic reality there a little bit more, but that's part of why the perception exists. Whatever the case, Antipas's leadership and ensuing hurricane of political and familial drama and craziness really resembles his dad. His dad made a mess by having, 4 wives? Something like that he rotated through. So he's got all of these competing step siblings that are his kids who are all going to want all of that power. They've all seen utter ruthlessness from their father, so they didn't exactly learn ethics or morality from him that would bring about some kind of restraint that they would exercise in how they treated their own family. No, what they saw from their dad was, your family offends you, murder them because you're allowed to, because you're above the law. Antipas is ruthless restless sexually. He likes the court life. He goes back to Rome on one particular trip, and in the court of Tiberius, he starts flirting with and hits it off with Herodias, who is his brother Philip's wife. Understandably, that's going to cause some friction. That's a weird thing to do. If this whole equation seems super ancient and different and distant to you, and it's hard to picture, like, well, people were just different back then. I don't know. Just picture at Thanksgiving where a couple of your family members get together and something like this goes down. It's going to make things really tense at dinner, and there's probably going to be some fallout that comes after that. These people are no different in that regard. They're jealous, they're angry, and the very stuff that John the Baptist is calling out, like this completely illegal, screwed up, weird, dark marriage that Herod Antipas pulled with his brother's wife, that exact thing that John the Baptist criticized ultimately bites Antipas in the butt and is the result of his downfall. And on that note, this seems as good a place as any to hit pause and resume this detailed history conversation about Herod Antipas and the Herod family in general mañana. So we will hit pause there. We'll pick it up right where we left off tomorrow. Thanks again to everybody who signed up to support the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. You rule. I appreciate you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.